Good morning. I'm Congressman Greg Casar, and I'm proud to represent the heart of Texas. And we are here in East Austin talking about what I believe to be the preeminent issue that we should be tackling at the federal level. We're in East Austin because this is an incredible place with an incredible history. In 1963, while people were at home watching Dr. King give his I Have a Dream speech, folks in East Austin weren't just at the March on Washington, they were at the March on Austin. Thousands of people marched on the state capitol from East Austin demanding the Voting Rights Act. And the congressman for East Austin, who then became the president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, signed that act into law. Also, right up the street here in East Austin is the final resting place of Sarah Weddington, who at 25 years old sued Dallas District Attorney Henry Wade and brought abortion rights to this entire country by winning the Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade. So this was the home of abortion rights. This was the home of voting rights. But in the decades since, right-wing billionaire donors got together and said they wanted to turn the home of abortion rights into a graveyard of reproductive rights. They wanted to turn the home of voting rights into a playground for special interest money and gerrymandered districts. And since then, they have focused on corrupting one of our most important institutions, the Supreme Court. They have packed it with partisan special interests. They have driven presidential elections to put Supreme Court justices onto the court that would do the bidding of special interest money rather than doing what's right for the American people. And so we have seen an erosion of environmental protections, attacks on our voting rights laws, actions like Citizens United that have allowed infinite corporate money to pour into our elections. They have given more rights to guns than to our kids. And of course, they handed down the Dobbs decision undoing Roe v. Wade. But it is up to us here in Texas and across the country to do what it was that we did generations ago anew and have a Supreme Court that is more committed to protecting our freedoms and rights rather than trampling them. And so that is why I'm an original co-sponsor of the Judiciary Act. We can expand the Supreme Court and put justices back on the court that care about everyday people and our rights and our freedoms. The Supreme Court has been expanded many times before, and it's time to do so again. And so we must expand the Supreme Court if we want our kids to have more rights than gun manufacturers. We must expand the Supreme Court if we want women to have more say over their health care than right-wing billionaire donors do. The Supreme Court should be a model of ethics, not the definition of disgrace that we have seen under Clarence Thomas and Brett Kavanaugh after what we've seen Donald Trump do to our Supreme Court, plummeting the public's approval and trust in such an important institution. And the Judiciary Act can restore that faith, restore that democracy, restore accountability and ethics to the Supreme Court. And once again, we can have a court that cares more about people, cares more about the Constitution, is patriotic and moral and ethical, rather than one that has become so partisan, so corrupted, and so untrustworthy. That we have done incredible things in Texas in our past, and we can do it again, and we have more momentum behind the Judiciary Act than ever before, and I'm proud to just be one part of that. Another key part of that is one of our Texas heroes, a legend of reproductive rights, of freedom, of the separation of church and state of our Constitution, and that is Cecile Richards.
Thank you, Congressman. Yay, Congressman. You have been such an incredible champion, and we're so glad you're in Washington representing us. It's great to be here today. Can I move this up? Okay, sorry. I wasn't sure how this... I was reluctant to touch the mic. Look, I mean, just picking up on what the congressman said, we're here today because the Supreme Court is no longer a source of justice in America. Women have had their most fundamental freedoms stripped away by this Supreme Court, and frankly, we are living in fear of what's next. Despite their testimony during confirmation hearings, reaffirming their respect for legal precedent, judicial precedent, 5 judges on the Supreme Court overturned nearly 50 years of the legal right for women to make their own decisions about pregnancy, a decision that is probably the most personal one we can make in our lifetime. Now, it's important that we did not lose this right because it was no longer a right we needed. In fact, since the Roe decision, abortion services in America are not only medically safe, but 1 in 4 women in America has an abortion. We didn't lose this right because the American people rose up and said, we don't need this anymore, and they changed their minds. In fact, support for Roe versus Wade and access to legal abortion has never been stronger. We lost this right because 5 members of the Supreme Court, 3 of whom were put on by Donald Trump and jammed through by Republicans in the Senate, these justices decided that their own politics and their own religious views were more important than the health and well-being of women in America. And the political backlash has been severe, and the personal toll on women has been enraging. State after state, voters have overwhelmingly reaffirmed their desire to live in a country that respects the most basic freedom, and yet this Supreme Court is above the will of the people. Women across America are being denied life-saving medical care because of the Dobbs decision. Doctors are being threatened with jail, and it is no longer safe to be a pregnant person in the United States of America. Right here in Texas, women continue to come forward, including Amanda Zarowski. Amanda was only able to receive an emergency abortion after she went into septic shock. And it's unclear that she will ever be able now to have a healthy pregnancy again in the future. This is 100% a result of the Dobbs decision. This Supreme Court is holding America hostage. Recently, Justice Alito was prepared to end access to medication abortion in this country because, in his words, it was not shown that women were likely to suffer irreparable harm. This is how little he understands or cares about the health and well-being of all of us. And we know from Justice Thomas's own concurring opinion in Dobbs that the freedom to make our own decisions, even about pregnancy, is only the beginning. He is willing to reconsider the longstanding right to birth control in America. This cannot stand. Every part of our democracy is at stake. Our right to control our bodies, our right to be safe from rampant gun violence, our right to vote and have fair representation. This court is tainted by unethical behavior, from the lack of financial disclosure to Justice Thomas's wife's involvement in efforts to overturn a fair election. It is beyond time to reform this court so that we can restore the faith of the American people and advance justice and equality. And that's why we're here today. We need to restore balance to the court, including expanding the court. We need to restore integrity to the court by having a binding code of ethics. And most importantly, this is not a tomorrow thing. This is a today thing. People's lives are at stake. Women's lives are at stake. And the time to act is now. So it's so great to be home back in Austin. I'm so excited to introduce Qadri, who is the city council member for my old neighborhood in Clarksville. So welcome. Good to see you.
Well, good morning, everyone. Just so thankful to be here today with heroes of mine and the congressman and Cecile and everyone else who's here. As it's been said, my name is Zohaib, and I'm proud to represent Austin on the City Council and to represent District 9. Our dais has just 2 members more than the bench on the Supreme Court, but it is immeasurably more representative of our community than the court is. My colleagues and I reflect the diversity of ages, of races, of genders, of religions, and political leanings of our city. The court, on the other hand, is a funhouse mirror distortion of America. In a country where Democrats have won the popular vote in the past 7 of 8 presidential elections, the majority of our justices are Republican appointees. They're making decisions that are not just eroding, but outright abolishing rights that poll after poll show Americans cherish. They are sending down rulings that enshrine corporation statuses over working Americans. They are taking us back to the Gilded Age of Victorian values. And we cannot let this happen. And the fact is, we don't have to let this happen. Congress has the constitutional authority to act, to expand the court and give President Biden the opportunity to balance the bench in a way that is fair and just and representative. The Supreme Court has been the source of some of the darkest turns in American history. Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, but it also redeemed our democracy during the Civil Rights era. A free society demands action, from protection of reproductive rights to protection from military-grade weapons at our schools and our outlet malls, to the protection of the fundamental right of workers to strike, to so much more. We demand action. So hear us. Abolish the Electoral College. Take politics out of redistricting. End lifetime judicial terms. But first and foremost, expand the Supreme Court and give the justice and rights Americans demand. And I'm so glad and humbled to introduce our next speaker, Drucilla Tigner, and she's kind of come up right now.
Thank you, Councilman. Thank you, everybody else, for being here today. Thank you to the Just Majority folks. As somebody who has been on a bus tour before, I know how hard this is, and I appreciate everything that you've done to put this together. My name is Drucilla Tigner, and I'm co-executive director at Planned Parenthood Texas Votes. We are the advocacy and political arm of the healthcare affiliates here in Texas, where we fight every single day for a person's right to access high-quality, judgment-free health care in their communities. And I have to say that job got a whole lot harder about a year ago when 9 unelected officials, thousands of miles from Texas, decided that my human right to decide when and if to have a child was no longer enshrined in the Constitution. They made that decision for us. And as a direct result of that decision, things are bad in Texas right now. It's really hard to overstate how bad it is in our state. You cannot get, there are 3 abortion bans in effect. You cannot get an abortion in the state. Even if, as Cecile said, if the pregnancy is life-threatening, you have to wait until you're actually dying to be able to get the care that you need. If you are facing a severe fetal abnormality, you cannot get care in the state at all, even if that abnormality is incompatible with life. And if you just don't want to be pregnant, if right now is not the right time to be pregnant, you have to drive or fly thousands of miles to be able to access the care that you need. And that's if you're able to. If not, you're going to be forced to carry that pregnancy against your will. So people in Texas right now are quite literally dying because of the Supreme Court. And I have to tell you, it's not because that's what Texans or Americans want. Texans and Americans both overwhelmingly want to have access to safe, legal abortion. But that's not the case right now in Texas, and that's not the case for 1 in 3 women in this country who might need access to care. You know, I'm a woman of reproductive age, and I have lots of friends who are of reproductive age who want to have children, who are in their mid to late 30s, who are terrified to get pregnant in Texas because the older you get, the more likely you are to have a complication. And if they're in a situation where they need emergency care right now, they may be sent back to the parking lot to wait for their lives to be saved. We're talking about it all the time. People are afraid to get pregnant in our state. And these are people that we need to stay right here, who have good jobs and support the economy. And we need people in Texas to be able to stay in Texas, not feel like they're forced to leave. You know, but our courts, they think they know better. They are now controlled by politically motivated judges and justices that have waged a relentless assault on our freedoms and have stripped us of our right to access abortion. And they do not care what the American people think, want, or need. The overturning of our federal constitutional right to abortion is just the beginning. Right now, a judge in Amarillo is trying to dictate health care for the entire country by overturning the FDA's decades-long approval of mifepristone, one of the safest and most common ways to access abortion in the state. And he's not stopping there. He was handpicked by conservative activists to try to shut down Planned Parenthood for good. There is a lawsuit right now in that court that is a fraudulent lawsuit that alleges Planned Parenthood did wrong that we did not do, and is trying to get $1.8 billion judgment for conservative folks whose only reason they are bringing this lawsuit is to shut us down. These conservative judges controlling our courts have shown they are willing to disregard legal precedent, undermine our constitutional rights and civil rights to further their own personal agendas. And we must rise up and restore balance and fairness and ethics to our courts. And that's why we're here today. That's what we're going to do. We need to implement reforms across all levels of federal courts, starting with expanding the number of justices on the Supreme Court. It is also high time we impose term limits on federal judges and justices to prevent undue influence of any one single administration or ideology for decades on end. We must add seats for additional judges for our lower federal courts, and we must dismantle the avenues for interest groups to shop for judges so they can further their extreme ideological agendas. I will say it again. Now, more than ever, we must take action to restore balance, fairness, and ethics in our courts. We deserve it, and the American people need it. We have to implement these necessary reforms so we can reclaim the very essence of justice and ensure that our courts truly represent the people's will and protect our democracy for generations to come. We owe it to every single American and every single Texan to take these necessary common sense steps to reform our judicial system. And now I'm proud to introduce Alencia Johnson. She is a longtime advocate for reproductive rights, former Planned Parenthood employee and advocate, and, you know, amazing person overall.
Thank you. It's so great to be back here in Austin, Texas. A funny story. When I first started working at Planned Parenthood, although I'm no longer there, it was 10 years ago. And my first trip to Austin, Texas was exactly 10 years ago with Cecile Richards on a bus tour that looked a little different, but it was about what? Standing with Texas women, because in Texas, they were modeling for the rest of the nation what it would look like to ban abortion access. And so it is full circle to be back here. I don't want to say it's a good reason to be back here, although I love the food in Austin. But I am grateful to be back here with so many advocates who not only want to protect abortion access, but also access to the ballot box, making sure that our communities are safe for children. It is a shame that in the wealthiest nation in the world, that children, the highest risk for children to die is at the hands of gun violence. We can easily change that, and yet we have a gun lobby that is more powerful than the people. Our voting rights are under attack. And this didn't just happen overnight. There was a history lesson that the congressman gave us years ago, I believe it was 2015, the Supreme Court gutted a key provision of the Voting Rights Act. There are so many of our rights that hang in the balance of this court, but when they overturned Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision, that made it so real for people in the United States. Those of us who have been fighting for reproductive freedom, we said this day would actually come. We knew this day would come. We were yelling ad nauseum to have our friends and allies understand that it could really happen with the way that these courts were made up, not just at the Supreme Court level, but throughout our entire judiciary system. But last year, when the Dobbs decision came down, immediately, patients were calling health centers like Planned Parenthood health centers to make sure that their appointment a week from now, a day from now, a month from now could still stand. And some of those patients, unfortunately, were told no and had to go to other states. Some of these women, as everyone here has talked about, were waiting until they were literally about to lose their lives. But the reality is it's a dark day in America for women even before the Dobbs decision, especially for women of color, especially for low-income women, especially for trans people who are trying to have children. There were women already incarcerated who were already being shackled as they were pregnant. There were women incarcerated because they were trying to access their right to abortion. As a person of deep faith, I would be remiss to actually push back on this religious ideology, quote unquote religious ideology, that has infected our judiciary system. You see, the reality is this fight against abortion access has nothing to do with religion. Over 50 years ago, evangelicals started losing when it came to segregation. And so their racist fight turned into a sexist fight. And they spent decades fighting for the ability to control women's bodies. And they took decades to change the makeup of our court systems? Well, I'm here to say that we're taking our power back. There's a poll out there, there are several polls out there that show a majority of Americans have lost faith in our judiciary system. They have lost faith in the Supreme Court. And while that is a very sad stat to talk about, that's a very dark day in this country, it gives people like me and everyone here a bit of hope that majority of people are on the side of freedom. They are on the side of ethics. And that majority of these people will continue to vote for members of Congress and our Senate who will pass the Judiciary Act. But it's so important that people understand what is happening in our courts so that they know we can elect as many pro-choice people up and down the ballot. We can elect people who are for voting rights. We can elect people who want to control the gun lobby, who want to get gun violence out of our communities. We can elect the most perfect officials from city councils to the halls of Congress, and yet everything that they do can be overturned by these conservative justices. And everything that they do, the years of advocacy, can be overturned, and we can feel that impact immediately as we did last summer. And I think that was a time for people to wake up and realize, oh, this isn't some arbitrary right that I will never, ever be able to, visualize in my life. No, this has a direct impact on my ability to live in a community full of opportunity and justice. And so I'm hopeful that as we continue to tour this country, talking about Supreme Court reform, talking about court reform, talking about the Judiciary Act, that more people, more women, LGBTQIA folks, young people, black people, immigrants, all of us, this big coalition, that's what they're scared of. This big coalition comes together and stands behind the members of Congress and our members in the Senate to push forward the Judiciary Act. And so I thank you for your time today, and I'm going to turn it back over to the Congressmember for question.
Thank you, Alencia. Thank you to Planned Parenthood Texas Votes, to Cecile, and to the council member. Especially a shout out here to the Just Majority bus tour and to Demand Justice for all of their work elevating this issue across the country. I'll take questions here in a minute, but just really want it to be clear that we are fighting for democracy. Instead of letting billionaires buy luxury vacations and partisan decisions from the Supreme Court, we should put American voters back in charge of our democracy. We should put Texas women back in charge of our democracy. We should put Texas veterans back in charge. We can put Texas working families back in charge with the Judiciary Act. All right, I think you could ask questions of any of us. Hi. Of course, thank you. The Judiciary Act would put new Supreme Court justices onto the court. We would be adding 4 justices to the court. And there have been multiple times in American history, many times, that the Congress has changed the number of justices on the court. So it is clearly constitutional. And we have already seen the Supreme Court be packed by these right-wing billionaires. We saw that so clearly, for example, like when Mitch McConnell wouldn't seat Obama's nomination to the Supreme Court. That was the beginning of the end for Roe v. Wade. That was the beginning of the end for voting rights. That was their continued solidification of things like Citizens United, so that the billionaire donors that wanted to get rid of reproductive rights, that wanted to get rid of voting rights, could continue to pour infinite money into the elections and continue to keep our Supreme Court justices from even having a real code of ethics. And so the Judiciary Act would add those justices and allow us to have a Supreme Court again that wants to protect our freedoms rather than trample those rights.
Yeah, I'll start. I think some of this, many people are thinking it started because of the Dobbs decision. It started way before that. I just mentioned the Voting Rights Act was gutted years ago. In my lifetime, I saw that. And the ethics that we're talking about, right? he referenced what happened when Mitch McConnell stole a seat from President Obama and yet rammed through 3, I would say some of them unqualified judges through the Senate to be confirmed. And so this conversation has been started, and there have been a lot of us having this conversation, particularly demand justice. When the Dobbs decision happened, a lot of people felt the very real impact. And so a coalition of folks, yes, reproductive rights advocates, racial justice advocates, environmental justice, gun violence prevention groups, all came together and said, we need to have a conversation with the public, with the community, to let them know that we hear them. It's one thing for our members to introduce this Judiciary Act, and you asked the question about what it's going to take to pass it. Yeah, it's going to take some time because we actually need more voters and more constituents to understand it. But that's actually why we're doing this right now, because people are paying attention, voters are paying attention. They're upset when they hear that Clarence Thomas is flying around on a billionaire's jet who could influence his decisions. They're upset when they hear that his wife was part of the strategy to try to overturn an election, was part of this insurrection. That is extremely problematic, and the will of the people is being ignored. And so there's a sense of urgency right now, especially as these decisions are about to come down, including one about affirmative action that will do more than just impact what's happening on college campuses. It will impact what's happening in our corporations who want to focus on inclusion and make people feel welcome. There are so many cases in our Supreme Court, on the Supreme Court docket right now, that we have to make sure the American people understand they have the ability to influence that, and making sure that this court is made up of people who will do the will of the people.
The only other thing I would add is I think many of us, perhaps naively, but just we kind of grew up thinking of the Supreme Court as being sort of the ultimate source of justice in America, a place where partisan politics would be put aside and fairness and progress would be upheld. And instead, but there clearly were a group of people in this country and a lot of the leadership of the Republican Party who saw the opportunity to make a major power grab in America by recasting the Supreme Court, by jamming on justices in a partisan fashion to do their political will. And so perhaps a lot of us are late to the show here, but I think increasingly what's happening is voters of all walks of life, independents, nonpartisan voters, are realizing the impact of the court is profound on every aspect of our daily lives, and it has to be a voting issue in every election going forth until we restore balance in America.
If you care about gun safety and don't want weapons of war in your kid's school, then you need to start asking your elected officials where they stand on the Judiciary Act. If you care about restoring abortion rights, then you need to start asking your elected officials where they stand on the Judiciary Act. If you care about the climate, if you care about the economy, if you care about getting big money and corruption out of politics, then you should be asking your elected officials where they stand on the Judiciary Act. So that's part of what this bus tour is all about, is that as Texans, we care about the environment. We care about stamping out corruption. We care about reproductive rights. And now we have to say, if we care about all those things, then we need to expand the Supreme Court. And that's what everybody should be asking as they get civically involved, is that one thing that unites all of these issues we care about is no longer having a hyper-partisan Supreme Court without a code of ethics where they are getting luxury trips bought and paid for by billionaires and are deciding life and death decisions based on billionaires' interests rather than voters' interests. Go ahead, please.
I also want to say, really, yes, contact your members of Congress, contact your local elected officials, but start talking about the issues in your communities. People do not know what the Supreme Court does. People do not know the difference between federal court and state court. People do not know how judges get appointed. And it is important, if you are wanting to get involved, educate yourself and educate your community and help them understand why this is important, why courts matter in this country. Because for years, as Cecile said, we have taken it for granted. The courts are the arbiter of justice. The Supreme Court can be trusted to be a firewall. We said it for years and years and years. The Supreme Court can be trusted to be a firewall for our rights. That is no longer the case. And it is our obligation as informed citizens to talk to the people in our communities, to talk to our friends and family, and to get actively involved in organizing those spaces. Because, you know, our members of Congress can't do it without us. We have an obligation to form our communities and mobilize our communities and get out to vote and educate them on why this is important. Thanks.
Sorry, I just can't resist. I'm sorry, I should have said this earlier. There was, in the former presidential election, former President Donald Trump made one promise to the American voters. He said, if you elect me, I will only appoint justices to the Supreme Court that will overturn Roe versus Wade. And he was good to his word. As I said, we did not lose this right because the American people changed their minds. We lost this right because he made a commitment to the right wing of his party to appoint justices that would overturn Roe. He has since said, so proud of the fact that that is his legacy. So elections have consequences. And there is no starker reminder of how important the coming elections will be than that commitment and what we've seen happen as a result.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Texas has been home in the past to abortion rights. Well, it was home in the past to voting rights, and actually home to so much of our environmental movement. We've been able to preserve open spaces, fight for clean air and clean water. But we see how these big industry players have gone directly after those protections that were so hard fought and won. The Environmental Protection Agency, that is charged with the public trust of protecting our water and air, has just been stripped of so much of its ability to make its own decisions. They're going after our consumer protection agencies, going after consumers' right to know that when they're buying something in the store, it's going to be safe for them and safe for their kids. And when you ask yourself, why would they do this? Go and look at what these right-wing billionaire think tanks wrote after the 60s and 70s. They wrote the plan saying, we now see that the voters have created these agencies to protect our air, to protect our water, to protect abortion rights, to protect civil rights. And they knew they couldn't win at the ballot box. They knew that most people want their products to be safe. They want their environment to be clean. They want their rights protected. So they knew they could get around that by having the Supreme Court do their dirty work. And now we need to restore the faith in the Supreme Court. We need to restore the Constitution, and we can do that through the Judiciary Act and by finally expanding the court. Thank you so much.